Chapter 21 focuses on the furnace of the Civil War. Chapter 21 is from 1861 to 1865, kind of focusing on the actual battles of the war, the Civil War. This chapter begins on page 435, and this is just a kind of an overview of the war. There's tons of information available on YouTube, on the internet, so please, if you're interested at all in any of these specific subjects within the Civil War, don't hesitate to do some additional research or additional information gathering. I am just going to try to go through this very quickly. However, there is enough information within this chapter that I'm going to break it up into two parts. So this is chapter 21, part 1. And again, we begin on page 435, and all information within this presentation, the images, the video links, all of this is within the public domain. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email or give me a phone call regarding those matters. So we're going to go ahead and begin with chapter 21 PowerPoint video presentation. As was briefly discussed in chapter 20, kind of the opening shots of the war occurred upon Lincoln's election, and that was the issue with South Carolina and Fort Sumter. The first battle, however, is Bull Run, 1861. First battle is known as Bull Run, or the First Battle of Manassas. Now, the North called the various battles by one name, and then the South called it by another name. So sometimes that gets a little confusing when you have two names for the same battle. First Battle of Bull Run. We're going to have Johnston as the immediate Confederate commander. This is the only battle in which he is kind of the lead commander. Johnston gets injured, and General Lee takes over from there on out. And Irwin McDowell is in charge for the Union. So we have Joe Johnston and McDowell. This is the first battle of the Civil War. Now, in this first battle, the Union did not expect to have much of a fight against the South. However, because of the heroic actions of Stonewall Jackson having his troops rally around him as if he was a stone wall, and the Confederates kind of launched a counterattack, and the Union troops were surprised, and they fled in confusion. So the Confederates, however, were too exhausted and disorganized to pursue. So this is a victory for the South. It could have been a catastrophe for the North, but the South was kind of disorganized and surprised by the victory and didn't know how to pursue the Union's retreat. But this is kind of Stonewall Jackson's coming out party, and from here on out, Jackson becomes General Lee's #1 go-to guy. And on page 436 in your textbook, first full paragraph on the right-hand column, the paradoxical consequences are talked about with regards to Bull Run, and this issue that defeat was better than victory for the Union because it dispelled any illusions that a one-punch war was possible, and it caused the Northerners to buckle down and to kind of take this war seriously. But victory was worse than defeat for the South because it inflated an already dangerous ego and overconfidence. So the South in Bull Run, the South was victorious, but that was worse than defeat. Whereas in the Union, defeat was actually a good thing because it kind of woke them up to the task at hand. So after Bull Run, McDowell is replaced by Little Mac McClellan, and we have a situation where the Peninsula Campaign occurs, and so the capital of Richmond is going to be attacked after Bull Run, and McDowell launches this attack up the peninsula. And during this campaign, the Confederacy does an amazing job of putting up fortifications and then retreating, putting up fortifications and retreating. And this series of bending but not breaking is kind of going to be an example for the rest of the war. So the Peninsula Campaign is to some degree marked with some success, but overall it's kind of a failure for the Union. And of course, President Lincoln then becomes frustrated with the overcautious McClellan, and he calls it the case of the slows. And one of the criticisms of McClellan was that he was hesitant. He loved his troops too much, and he was hesitant and unable to put his troops in harm's way. And so eventually McClellan is going to be replaced, and then a series of generals will ensue for Lincoln. And so this constant replacement of generals for Lincoln becomes one of the weaknesses for the North, whereas the South, once they choose General Lee to be in charge, this becomes a great advantage for the South. Now it's after the Peninsula Campaign that it becomes very evident that this is going to be a long war, and so a total war strategy is adopted, and this is discussed on page 438 in your textbook, composing of six components. The total war, we're talking about slowly suffocating the South by blockading the coasts. Eventually, we're hoping to take the Mississippi River, and sometimes it's referred to as the Anaconda strategy, as a large snake try to constrict and gradually squeeze the South. And one of those big essential components was blockading the coast. Then eventually liberate the slaves, undermining the very economic foundations of the South. Grab the Mississippi River, and then you can have this river blockade, and then you chop up the Confederacy to pieces by sending troops into Georgia, and you split then into an east and west southern Confederacy, hopefully then capture the capital and try everywhere to engage the enemy's main strength, eventually grinding it into submission, understanding that the North had the advantage in population and wealth and transportation and manufacturing, and so to engage the enemy totally was to eventually win the war. So those components are talked about in the first full paragraph, left-hand column on page 438. Another weakness then that the South had, they did not have much, if any, navy. Most of the navy that the South relied on were privateers, private vessels. So then you have a blockade at sea, but the issue then is how do you handle foreign merchants who are maybe potentially trying to supply the South. And so there were some occurrences in which on page 438 and 439 there was some tension. This idea that the Yankee captains would seize British freighters on the high seas, and then if they had war supplies, would deny them passage to the South. Another aspect then of the war at sea was the development of these ironclads, and the idea that the Monitor and the Merrimack, these ironclads, the first ships to actually engage in a war that were protected by iron. And those are discussed, I believe, on page 439. Now, after the Peninsula Campaign, McDowell is replaced by General Pope, John Pope, and we have a second battle at Bull Run. So this line of secession goes McClellan, then the series of generals for the North goes McDowell, then McClellan, then Pope, then back to McClellan, and then McClellan gets fired for the second time, and that gets us to the Battle of Fredericksburg, and we have Burnside, then Hooker, then Meade, then finally General Grant. So you can tell that during all those generals, generals for the North, the South has one general, Robert E. Lee. And so the second Battle of Bull Run is a disaster. Then, if you look here, it's a disaster for the North. So as Pope becomes the commander, General Pope had boasted that on the Western Theater, he had only seen the backs of the enemy. Lee quickly gave him the front view, fiercely attacking Pope's troops and inflicting a crushing defeat. And so the Bull Run, second Battle of Bull Run, was a brutal loss for the North. The North retreats. Lee then is emboldened by his success and daringly thrusts into northern territory, hoping for a quick victory on northern soil. Goes into Maryland. He hopes to strike a blow that would encourage then foreign intervention on the side of the South, thus potentially encouraging the North to seek an armistice and a ceasefire. So Pope then gets fired. McClellan gets rehired as the general for the North, and McClellan must then face the South on northern soil for the first time in Maryland. So in Maryland, that leads us to the Battle of Antietam, and this is known as the single bloodiest day in the Civil War. And of course, if you look at this, we've got well over 20,000 casualties on both sides, and this is a very close battle, but remembering that it is on northern soil, close is in favor then of the North. And there's a couple of really kind of bizarre things that happen that favor the North during this particular battle. And this is a famous picture of Abraham Lincoln right before the Battle of Antietam. So in the days and hours leading up to the Battle of Antietam, there's a famous story about the Special Orders 191. And the Special Orders were in fact a secret kind of battle plan that were discovered by the North. These were the Southern General Lee's battle plans, and so this is kind of a copy of the battle plans for Antietam, and they were wrapped around some cigars, and just by happenstance, Northern soldiers discovered these battle plans. Now, McClellan then had to kind of decide whether or not this was misinformation conveniently lost by the South, or was it in fact actual battle plans. Eventually, McClellan does take advantage of these battle plans and is able to basically win this battle. But it is the bloodiest single day in American history, 23,000 casualties. Lincoln hastily restores McClellan to active command, and then, of course, because of Lee's battle plans, then McClellan is able to have some success. Now, one of the problems with this is that McClellan, when he does have this victory at Antietam, McClellan does not pursue Lee in the South in their retreat. he does not aggressively pursue the retreat, and so the South is able to escape Maryland back to Richmond and prepare to fight for another day. And this then leads Lincoln to, of course, then fire McClellan for the second time. So a couple of results from Antietam, pivotal results. It was a draw. Both sides were kind of inflicted. Both sides had a lot of pain inflicted with the casualty amount, but because Lee was forced to retreat, it is considered a Northern victory. And because McClellan then does not pursue the retreat, McClellan is removed from command for a second and final time. Now this victory, even though it's not, an earth-shattering victory, this victory allows Lincoln then to launch his Emancipation Proclamation. And so it's right shortly after Antietam where Lincoln delivers the Emancipation Proclamation, and so both sides now realize that the war is about a little bit more than just states' rights. The war becomes a war about freeing slaves. When the war becomes a war about freeing slaves, then both the French and the British and the French governments cooled all interests in diplomatic mediation. And so you can see how Antietam is a very pivotal battle, because if the South could have won that battle, would Lincoln have been forced to sue for peace? Would the British or the French, would they have gotten involved on the side of the South? Just a lot of what-ifs in the Battle of Antietam. And then, interestingly enough, that Battle of Antietam also then had the lost dispatches, the special orders that were found, the battle plans that were found. So much was riding on that one battle, and did the North just get lucky? So then, focusing a little bit more on emancipation. So the Emancipation Proclamation is given right after Antietam. This is a painting, an image of Lincoln and his cabinet, and they're kind of trying to understand and trying to hammer out this proclamation. But the interesting part of this Emancipation Proclamation is Lincoln is still very concerned about the border states. And so is this a proclamation without any real emancipation? So where he could, he would not. So where Lincoln could emancipate the slaves, that would be the border states of Kentucky, West Virginia, Missouri. Where he could, he didn't. He would not. And where he would, he could not. So Lincoln did emancipate the southern slaves. In other words, right after Antietam, Lincoln freed the slaves in Virginia, in South Carolina, in North Carolina. But because we were at war, they remained slaves. So where he did emancipate slaves, he really couldn't. And where he could, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, Rhode Island, where he could, he would not. Sorry, not Rhode Island, but Delaware. So Lincoln did not free the slaves from the loyal border states, but tried to free the slaves from the Confederate States. So call your attention to that, and that's on page 441 in your textbook, the Proclamation Without Emancipation. On page 443 in your textbook, the discussion then occurs about what do you do now with slaves that the North, as the North invades the South, and as the North then takes over and conquers territory, then slaves in that territory become free. Also, then what happens to the Northern African Americans who maybe want to fight? And they want to fight for the North. And so you have this famous story of the 180,000 blacks that served in the Union Army. And one of the most famous stories, of course, is the 54th Massachusetts, the volunteer infantry. And again, there's a great movie called Glory with Denzel Washington and Matthew Broderick. I'd encourage you to watch that movie if you have not seen it. But it focuses on some of the issues of the 54th Massachusetts and some of the things, the tensions that African Americans had to face in a war that was by this time about slavery. So after Antietam, the South, led by Robert E. Lee, the South retreats. After Antietam, the South retreats from Maryland down to Fredericksburg. And so at this point, McClellan is fired. Burnside takes over command. He has great sideburns. Burnside takes over, and he is then asked to attack. And he is faced kind of with a lose-lose situation. Burnside is asked to be aggressive because McClellan was not, and yet Burnside is faced with a enemy, the Confederacy, that is entrenched on great fighting ground. So Fredericksburg turns into a bloodbath for the Union, but Burnside feels like he has to attack. So this is down in the South right after kind of this moral wave of good morale, where you have this Emancipation Proclamation, this victory in Maryland at Antietam, and then we have this crushing blow that occurs at Fredericksburg. And if you look here, again, you might say, yeah, here, 12,000 casualties compared to 5,000. And so this is Fredericksburg. So looking at the Battle of Fredericksburg, you have a river here where you have basically Burnside's, the Union, and Hooker, but Burnside and the Union are entrenched here, and Lee and the Confederates are up here on kind of a ridge, and they have their cannon fire entrenched, and they also then have trees and kind of a rock wall. And because Burnside has replaced McClellan, somebody who has a reputation of being cautious, Burnside feels pressure to attack. So Burnside feels like he must attack, even though he is in this kind of utterly hopeless position. So the action at Marie's Heights, the action up here in Marie's Heights, is that you had all of these Confederate soldiers lined up, firing down on the Union as they tried to attack. And so the action on the Heights also included a charge of the Irish Brigade. 545 of the 1,300 men in the attack were lost. The Confederate losses totaled around 1,200. The falling of darkness and the pleas of Burnside's subordinates were enough to end this attack. And so just a very interesting day in American history. Again, we don't have time here to go into all of the details, but suffice to also notice that you have this crossing of the river, and the crossing of that river occurred on these pontoon boats. So a pontoon bridge was constructed, which took a couple of days. Meanwhile, the Confederates are entrenched upon this ridge, watching the Union. They know exactly where they're going to attack. So the Confederates train their cannon fire right here and right here. So you have a situation where the Union must attack and then survive the crossing of the river and then attack up the hill. And this was going to go badly. So this is also then an artist's rendering of this bridge building that occurred by the Corps of Engineers for the Union Army. So that's Fredericksburg. So then after Fredericksburg, Burnside is fired and Hooker takes over. Now Hooker, we're still here at Fredericksburg. Hooker is going to launch an attack. So Hooker is going to launch an attack right here. And at the same time, he is going to take a good portion of his men and do a northern envelopment and swing around with the goal of coming in from behind on Lee. So going around and coming in from behind on Lee. Lee senses this and sends Stonewall Jackson out over here to face Hooker and his men as they are coming for this northern envelopment. So you have a clash that occurs right here, where Stonewall Jackson for the Confederates has set up a wedge here, and he kind of sets up a trap for Hooker to kind of get swallowed up on. Now, as dusk is falling, the Confederates, led by Jackson, they start to close the wheel, close the door, and the Union retreat. But as the Confederates are closing the door, you have issues of friendly fire right here. And unfortunately for the Confederates, Stonewall Jackson is hit by friendly fire by his own men. Dies a couple of days later. But the overall result of this Chancellorsville, the Battle of Chancellorsville, so the overall result of the Battle of Chancellorsville is that Hooker is defeated, and once again now Hooker retreats and brings his men back, and so then you have Hooker basically trying to refortify right here, and Lee sees another opportunity to potentially get a victory on northern soil. And so while Hooker is trying to refortify, Lee grabs all of his men and heads north eventually into Pennsylvania. It kind of sets up the scene for the next battle we'll talk about, which is Gettysburg. So Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, the hero of Bull Run, and also kind of the right-hand man of General Lee, Stonewall Jackson was wounded by friendly fire, incorrectly identified as Union cavalry shot by friendly fire, had to have his arm removed, and contracts pneumonia, and eventually dies a day or two later. And so this is a very serious defeat and loss for the Confederates. So at this point, we've talked about Bull Run, then we move into the Peninsula Campaign, then we get into Bull Run 2, then we go over to Antietam, then we come back down to Virginia with Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. And so hopefully we're following along here. The next battle that we talk about is Gettysburg, as Lee tries to get another victory on northern soil, and we have Hooker being replaced by General Meade, and we're going to have a confrontation by Meade and Lee at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. But we'll go ahead and end this Part 1 PowerPoint presentation at this point, and Part 2 will start up with Gettysburg. So that concludes the video presentation for the Part 1 Civil War Chapter 21. Just a reminder that the images within this PowerPoint video are in the public domain. Thank you.